Slice of life is a genre that carries an endless amount of possibilities in terms of what subjects can be covered within it. It can simply be about a bunch of irresponsibly adorable little girls eating cake and talking about their socks. Or it can even dive into some really deep and dark subjects that leave you walking away with a head full of questions. It is essentially a genre without boundaries because almost anything can be referred to slice of life in one way or another. And in this situation, I watched a series that was at times simply about drinking tea, but was also able to ask legitimate and meaningful questions to the viewer. So hello, welcome back, and I present to you a review of Ive no Jikan, Time of Eve, a 6-episode slice of life sci-fi O&A series. It was distributed online between 2008 and 2009, produced by Studio Rika, and created, written and directed by Yasuhiro Yoshiura. Also worth noting is that in 2010 the series was squished together into a movie that contains about 15 minutes of original footage. Haven't seen that though, so I can't vouch for its quality, but I'm under the impression the two of them are very similar. Right then, this wonderful little tale is set in a not too distant future where robotics technology has taken off in a big way. Androids with perfect human appearances are now a very common part of society, and though they are all created to work obediently and serve their masters, there are many groups who have problems with them. Any who speak of these androids as anything other than material objects are looked down on by the general public, but there are of course those who ignore this prejudice and have strong feelings for android partners. This idea sits at the core of a story that revolves around a high school student by the name of Rikuo Sakisaki. This guy's family, like most in the current era, have a house android who does all the boring stuff around their crib, and one day he finds a strange phrase in her activity log that simply reads, "Are you enjoying the time of Eve?" This leads him and his buddy Masaki to go and check out the source of this phrase, that being a small hidden away cafe, unsurprisingly called Time of Eve. This cafe exists by the rule of no discrimination between humans and robots, and thus it is a place designed for androids and humans to coexist and spend time together as equals. And this is essentially the full brunt of this thing's narrative. Rikuo and Masaki spend a lot of time here, and we are treated to some really wonderful snippets of the lives of those who visit this cafe. We learn of how the world works and get a really perfect image of a future that could easily come into existence. It's not rammed with apocalypse and war as a result of these androids, but nor has it become a utopia. It's a future reality that I can get behind and relate to. And from this, the series was able to establish what I believe is basically the perfect tone for a story like this. It's a serious setting with genuine issues, but it's incredibly serene and relaxed in its presentation because the world isn't perfect, but it's not full of evil either. This tone is so rarely seen presented so well because often it ends up just being too ridiculous or silly or just dark and gloomy. And again, this is all down to that realism I was talking about. The androids felt believable, the technology present was absolutely possible, and all characters felt so undeniably human in the way they were written. And just this style of story was so perfect and different to a lot of similar media I've seen before. There's the idea of those wanting to fall in love with robots, but there's no situation where people are running away from society to do so. There's the idea that robots could be a danger to humanity, but there's no, "The robots have all gone crazy and they're going around killing everyone!" It was basically ideal. It utilised these themes and ideas, but presented them in a way that made this thing essentially a perfect example of post-cyberpunk. It had all of the implications, ideas and technology, but none of the assumed dystopia. And from this setting, it's able to convey a lot of great ideas and ask a lot of very meaningful questions to the viewer. Those viewing machines as living things, those who look down on these people, the propaganda surrounding this, and just everything this series does to present conflicted morals. It's also thought-provoking, or rather it would be if we hadn't seen it all before. Essentially, all the questions this show asks you play on themes we've seen many times in most works of fiction that have a similar setting. The whole "what does it mean to be alive" thing and discriminating against machines is such a common idea in the genre, and thus a lot of what made this show what it was felt like it lacked variety. But the saving grace of this thing ended up being that tone I spoke about, and having established that, this content was made to feel really new and refreshing, and it still managed to get me thinking, even though every piece of android-based fiction and their dogs have asked me these questions more times than I've had bowls of cereal. Actually, that's not true, I eat way too much cereal. It was a really touching story. It used every subject it has at its disposal in the best way it could and never outstayed its welcome. 6 15-minute episodes was a perfect length to convey this thing's ideas. It was a great watch and made for a really relaxing little afternoon experience. Then in terms of characters, there isn't all that much to say overall because of how realistic all the key players came across and also how little time I spent with them. The android characters had a great contrast in how they acted as servants in comparison to when they were able to act as humans in Time of Eve. Rikuo was a very calm and kind individual overall. He didn't have any exaggerated quirks, and the only importance of the character generally was his attitude towards androids. And that attitude and how it changes is one of the key plot points of the series, so I shan't go too deep on it, but overall he was certainly a character who filled his role exceptionally well. He wears glasses, so he's brilliant no matter what. Then Masaki comes across as a very different chap to Rikuo, in that he almost feels like a delinquent in how he presents himself. He's a very to-the-point individual, and he sticks firmly to his ideals. I honestly wasn't expecting a great amount from him in this series from how he was presented initially, because I thought he was just going to be some negative and sarcastic chap who has a go at Rikuo for being a robo-lover, but later on he does a few things to really surprise me, and for that he was great. I felt it was a very strong cast, and they were all fully developed considering how short the series was. And in terms of art style and their design, I'm going to drop that word again and say everyone just appeared very realistic. None of their designs were all that memorable or striking, but that would be completely out of place in this thing. Everyone had a very fitting appearance, and I had no issues. Then for animation, there was a lot of CGI, but it was... Wait a minute. I said there was a lot of CGI! That's more like it. Yeah, there was a lot of that, but it worked really well actually. Like there were times when entire characters would be made of CG and so much other stuff was too, but it just worked. It certainly looked off occasionally when it felt really static and jarring, but even here it works fairly well because it matched the whole robotic feeling this show had. But the biggest thing I loved about this thing's visuals was the way the scenes were constructed with the shots and angles the director chose, and the lighting was so nice. Everything had this really mellow and soft colour to it, so the shadow and shifting focus in many scenes had this thing ended up really great to look at for reasons that aren't commonly seen. And a lot of that does come down to this thing's visual direction and not just its production quality, so it gets a mighty big thumbs up from me for that. But unfortunately on the audio side of things, there was one thing I really wasn't fond of, and it was a real shame because overall it was of very high quality. So the music was brilliant, like it was incredibly different and had this really modern and interesting sound to it that not only matched the material perfectly, but worked to add a great deal to it as well. But the problem was, it felt at times that the audio levels were just completely screwed up, and the timing they added some of this music to punch through a joke or sequence of dialogue was really iffy. They'd raised the volume to the point where the characters' voices were almost drowned out, and it just felt really odd, so I was glad they didn't do it all that often. Other than this though, the voice acting was very consistent, and especially when it came to the android characters, it was done pretty much perfectly. It wasn't just some generic, "I am Robo Rodney, would you like a Dr. Pepper?" It felt like legitimately advanced automated speech. It was clear who was and wasn't an android, but it wasn't as if they were telegraphing it to the audience with an "I am a robot" billboard stuck to their head. And with that, I do believe I'm done talking about this show. Bit less to say than usual, but it's a fairly short series with a fairly simple story, and one that I was very pleasantly surprised by. After the first few episodes, I was liking it, but the further I got in, I found myself completely drawn into its world. So today I shall be delivering a bicentennial 77% rating on this thing, and absolutely recommend checking it out if you want a nice relaxing story that won't take up much of your time. So this thing actually had a Kickstarter a couple of months ago that funded it for an international Blu-ray release, but if you can't wait until that's out, then you can head down to the link in the description and check it out on Crunchyroll. And with that, have you seen this show? If so, what did you think of it? And as always, like, subscribe, and feel free to drop me a recommendation of what you want me to review next. But that is enough for today. See you next week. Oi, Rodney.
Yes, sir, what do you want?
Guess a Dr. Pepper, would you?
I'm sorry, we only have Dr. Pop.